Hello everyone, welcome back to Classical Archaeology. In this video, we're going to discuss the early Roman Empire from about 27 BCE to about 235 CE, or Common Era. We'll be discussing the reign of Augustus Caesar all the way to what is called the Crisis of the 200s. Just under 200 years of history. And we'll be looking at some of the material culture the Romans of the early empire left behind during this period. We will start our consideration of the early Roman Empire by looking at the first dynasty of Roman emperors, which is commonly known as the Julio-Claudian dynasty, also known as the Caesar dynasty. The emperors in the Julio-Claudian dynasty include Augustus Caesar, Tiberius, Caligula, Claudius, and Nero. Contemporaries, Romans at the time of the early empire, and modern archaeologists and scholars generally thought of Augustus Caesar as being the best emperor of the dynasty. And nowadays, looking back at the Roman Empire, we generally think of Augustus as being probably the best of all Roman emperors. Although Augustus Caesar had turned Rome into a monarchy in all but name, the emperors had basically absolute power in the Roman Empire. Augustus Caesar tried not to live too extravagantly. He tried not to live like a king. He still lived like a wealthy man, but he did not live even better than other wealthy Romans. And he was very conscious of how he carried himself and how he curated his image. He tried to portray himself as a general and as the first citizen, as the Romans referred to their emperors, but not as a king. He didn't want to violate the Roman system of obligation and patronage. He was the chief patron of the Roman people. He was not a king. He knew that Roman society, especially wealthy Romans, did not like kings. So he always tried to carry himself like the chief citizen. Later emperors would not do this nearly as well, and some emperors would flaunt their wealth and flaunt their power. A notable example of an emperor who didn't really care what other people thought and did whatever he wanted, violating the Roman system of obligation and patronage, was the Emperor Nero, shown here on this slide. What's interesting about this bust of Nero is it shows him with a strange chin-strap beard, very unusual in Roman sculpture. Usually, if Romans had beards, they had a beard and a mustache, but Nero did not. Also, Nero lived in a period where generally Roman men were clean-shaven, so he was trying to buck the system and buck traditions in a way that Augustus Caesar did not do. But the Emperor Nero drew a lot of ire onto himself, not only for his personal style, but for how he ruled the empire. We'll discuss Emperor Nero a little bit later in the video. And by the way, the Emperor Nero was considered to be one of the worst of all Roman emperors, and you'll certainly see why very soon. Before discussing some other Roman emperors, we're going to discuss Augustus Caesar's rule, specifically what is called the Pax Romana, or the Roman peace. Having subdued all of Rome's enemies in the Mediterranean basin, and really in most of Europe, the Roman Empire experienced a time of peace and prosperity in its heartland, in its provinces that were away from the frontier, during the reign of Caesar Augustus, and even for long afterwards. There was some fighting on the frontier during Augustus Caesar's reign, but not enough to destabilize the empire like you'd see in later parts of Roman history. For example, there was the Battle of Teutoburg Forest in 9 CE, which was a massive defeat for the Roman military, on par with the Battle of Cannae during the Second Punic War, but it was not enough to destroy the Roman Empire. It just changed Roman plans for expansion into what is now Germany. The Romans basically elected to not try to expand their empire past the Rhine River into what is now Germany. The Germanic tribes were deemed to be too warlike and not worth the effort of conquest. During his reign, Augustus Caesar focused on integrating the empire he had built for the people of Rome. He did this through the construction of infrastructure, including roads, aqueducts. Port cities like Carthage and Corinth were rebuilt during his reign to bring wealth into the Roman Empire. Trade by sea was very important to the Romans. Roman ships plied the sea lanes in the Mediterranean. They were basically the sole naval power in the Mediterranean at this point because they controlled all the land around the sea. The Romans actually referred to the Mediterranean Sea not as the Mediterranean or Middle Sea, but as Mare Nostrum, our sea. There was also trade over land during Augustus's reign and after, using the famous Roman roads, which were very durable. And also these roads and this infrastructure was guarded by the Roman military, its legions, and then by its auxiliaries as well. Although Rome was experiencing what we might call a period of peace and prosperity, good times, a lot of Romans were worried about the Roman people becoming weak and soft and decadent and corrupt during this period of prosperity and peace. And Augustus Caesar was also very concerned about this as well. To discourage corruption, discourage decadence, Augustus Caesar made sure that his palace, or house as it was called, the Domus Augusti, House of Augustus, was nice and ornate, but not too fancy. It was not to be that much bigger than the palace of another just wealthy Roman citizen. It was built on the Palatine Hill in Rome, in the center of the city. It is large and is expensive, but it's not much bigger than the house that a wealthy Roman citizen would have. Augustus was very conscious about his image, and he wanted to make sure that nobody got it into their heads that he was a king or trying to live like a king. His domicile was fancy, but it wasn't too fancy. It was a home fitting for the first citizen, the emperor, but it was not the mansion of a king. Remember, wealthy people did need to have big houses in ancient Rome. Wealthy people were patrons. They needed to have large houses with large rooms so that they could have enough room for their guests and their clients. Clients would come to beseech the patron for help and for assistance. And the emperor would receive his clients, Roman citizens and politicians, in his home, the Domus Augusti. And what you'll see is that Augustus's house is much plainer and smaller than palaces built by later Roman emperors, which will cause some problems for the Roman government, as you'll see later in the video. And this is a shot of the exterior of Augustus Caesar's house. You can see it's made of mostly of brick with some other types of stonework, and you can see the prominent Roman arches. The Romans were famous for their arches that they built. We'll talk more about arches later on. Here are some shots of the frescoes inside the various rooms. The frescoes are overlaid over stone and brick. The frescoes have been partially restored, but the frescoes definitely decorate the space, but they're not nearly as fancy as the decorations used in other Roman palaces. Here's a shot of the exterior courtyard of the Domus Augusti. It's set up similar to a Roman villa, but it's in the middle of the city of Rome, and it's bigger than the average Roman villa, but it's not too extravagant, especially compared to palaces of other Roman emperors that will come after Augustus. Some more examples of the frescoes. The workmanship is good. There has been some archaeological restoration, though, keep in mind. Here is a view of the plan of Augustus's house. You can see that it's got several stories, and then it is centered around a courtyard. It is large, but it's not nearly as large as palaces built later on by later Roman emperors. Here is a comparison of the Domus Augusti, the palace or house of Augustus. Compare it with later palaces built by other Roman emperors. The Domus Augustana or the Domus Flavia, they are at least 3 times the size of Augustus's palace or house. Remember, Caesar Augustus or Augustus Caesar, he did not want anyone to think that he was a king. So now we'll talk about some of the historians that were writing about the early Roman Empire. And we'll talk about how their stories line up with the archaeological record as we found it. One very important historian is Titus Livius, otherwise known as Livy. He lived from about 59 BCE to about 17 CE. And he recorded the history of monarchical and republican Rome. He was not an eyewitness of events. He was writing about events that had happened centuries before, so he had to rely on sources written by other people. Livy was a friend of Augustus Caesar. Augustus wanted to support historians like Livy who were going to tell the story of Rome and tell the story of Rome's, difficult founding, their struggle to form the republic, and their struggle against their enemies, not only in Italy, but in the Mediterranean region as a whole. And he thought that these stories would be a good education for young Roman men, particularly young males in the upper class who wanted to get into the military or into politics. And he thought that stories or historical accounts recorded by Livy would inspire those people to do good things to fulfill their obligations to Rome. Livy's work is called The Founding of the City. It's his only surviving work. Basically, it's a history of Rome from its founding all the way up until about the time that he was living. There are a lot of mythological stories mixed into Livy's account, and there's probably some pro-Roman bias as well. But that's why we as archaeologists, we study material culture, we study artifacts, because historians and authors and people just writing, they present their own opinion of the past, of what's going on around them, and sometimes they don't see the whole picture, or sometimes they are biased, or they get things absolutely wrong and they fabricate things. I don't think that Livy was a fabricator. I think he was a very good historian by the standards of the period. But we want to read sources like Livy's from the founding of the city, alongside archaeological sources that we can analyze to get a fuller picture. Livy would also go on to tutor the future Roman Emperor Claudius. Livy's work is written in Latin. It's one of the first histories of Rome that are written in Latin. Previous histories about the Roman people or about the region around Italy were written in Greek, usually by Greek scholars, but Livy made a conscious decision to write this history in Latin, the language of the Romans. And it highlights the growth of a Roman Latin intellectual tradition and an interest in the past, something that Augustus Caesar wanted to cultivate in order to inspire young Romans to do their duty and to serve their obligations to the empire. Another author that was writing about the time that we're talking about here is Publius Virgilius Maro, better known as Virgil. He was a Roman poet that lived from 70 BCE to 19 BCE, so he dies early in the reign of Augustus Caesar. And he's not a historian. He is a epic poet. He's not trying to tell a accurate historical story. He's trying to tell a epic poem that's meant to be a good story, meant to be inspiring, rather than entirely factual. He writes a story called the Aeneid, which is a mythical historical epic written in the style of older Greek historical epics, which tell stories from the past, but there's a lot of embellishment, and they're not meant to be 100% true. Certainly with Virgil's story, that's the case. And the work is meant to inspire the Roman people to do great things, like their mythological ancestors. It also helps to inspire the Romans' animosity towards people like the Greeks and the Carthaginians, but to inspire the people to understand their struggle against the Greeks and the Carthaginians in more noble terms. The poem tells the story of the doomed love of Aeneas of Troy. According to Virgil, the Romans are descendants of exiles who fled the city of Troy after it was destroyed by the Greeks. So the idea was the Greeks drove Aeneas out of his ancestral homeland, leading him to go to Italy, where he would be an ancestor to Romulus and Remus, who we talked about in a previous video. That would explain why the Romans and the Greeks were enemies in the past. On his way, he falls in love with Dido, Queen of Carthage. We know that Troy was destroyed at about 1200 BCE, whereas Carthage was founded about 800 or so BCE. So there's no way that Aeneas could have visited Carthage. It was built 400 years after if he were a real person, when he would have lived. So this is a fictional account with some historical inspiration, as opposed to a true history. There's also a lot of very miraculous supernatural stories. Aeneas goes to the underworld, for example, and then returns to the human world. It's meant to be an inspiring mythological tale for the Romans. And Aeneas' story, it was meant to remind Romans of a supposedly simpler and more honorable mythical time in the past that was better than the present, the Pax Romana, where everyone was too comfortable and too wealthy, and they didn't have anything to struggle against. Obviously, this wasn't true, because there were a lot of Romans who were not doing well, who were very poor. And there were slaves in the Roman Empire. And the Roman Empire did have some tactical challenges in the Pax Romana, which we'll see throughout this video. And scholars will debate Virgil and whether he was pro or anti Augustus Caesar. Virgil, it's thought that he may have been subtly saying that it was not good to have emperors, and maybe we should go back to having a republic. We, as in the Romans, should go back to having a republic. But others say that he was actually supportive of Augustus Caesar, because Augustus, as emperor, could bring stability to Roman society, stability that the republic had failed to bring because it was too weak. Another author during this period, poet as well, is Publius Ovidius Naso, better known as Ovid. Ovid lived from about 43 BCE and died about 17 or 18 CE. He was a very prolific poet. He wrote Metamorphoses, which is his most famous work. It's about 15 semi-compact but chronological books about gods, humans, and the divinity of the Caesar family, actually. It's a bit more cynical and subversive of a work than Virgil's Aeneid, even though he shows that the Caesar family, or he argues that the Caesar family are related to gods. The gods in Ovid's story do not come off as being very noble or honorable. These books written by Ovid show the deities are portrayed as being dishonest, capricious, and unable to control themselves. They're not a good example for humans. They're a very bad example. And you hear about them manipulating and mistreating humans and other spiritual beings. These humans are being sexually assaulted by the gods and other deities. Or they're being transformed into all sorts of strange and, in some cases, really hideous forms by the gods, all for the pleasure of these supernatural powers. Naturally, Augustus Caesar, a man who wanted to respect Roman institutions like the Roman religion and the gods, he hated Ovid's work and actually had Ovid banished outside of the empire to a place called Tomis, which is in the Danube River Valley today. Everyday Romans, however, loved Ovid's work. Those that could read and were literate read it and found it to be very interesting and entertaining. Although some more conservative Romans thought the story was too sexual and it was disrespectful to the gods, and they saw its popularity as a sign of Roman social decline during this period of peace and prosperity that was the Pax Romana. And this slide shows a later bronze of Ovid actually in Tomis, where he was exiled. And then on the other side of the slide is a fresco of Medea, a human character that is very prominent in Ovid's Metamorphoses. And this fresco is from Herculaneum, which we'll talk about later in this video. This is the mausoleum of Augustus Caesar. It's been partially restored, as you can see, the different types of building materials being used. It was built around 28 BCE, and then Augustus Caesar's remains, his ashes, were interred in this mausoleum in about 14 CE, Common Era. This is what the mausoleum looked like before the restoration work was completed. You can see it's significantly overgrown. Most of that brush has been cleared away, and a lot of the masonry has been repaired. The mausoleum of Augustus, it's circular, a series of levels, multi-levels. It was built outside the old city of Rome, but since then the city of Rome has grown all around the site. The ashes of Augustus Caesar and his family were interred in this tomb. Remember, the Romans at this point in history generally preferred to cremate their dead. Sometimes burial customs were different out on the frontier of the Roman culture. This was intended to be a family tomb, similar to the Etruscans. Remember, the Etruscans liked to build family tombs where the ashes of multiple generations of people would be placed in the tomb, basically a house for the dead. The mausoleum was possibly sacked by the Visigoths, a Germanic tribe, barbarian tribe, as the Romans would have called them, that invaded Rome between 411 and 410 CE. It's said that they broke into the tomb and that they scattered the ashes everywhere and just made a mess of things. Later on, after the fall of the Western Roman Empire, the mausoleum was used as a theater because of its round shape, and excavation and restoration work began in the 1930s. Benito Mussolini and the government of Italy at the time were very interested in rebuilding Roman monuments as a way to solidify and consolidate their power over Italy. This is a map of the city of Rome. You can see that Augustus's mausoleum is outside of the old city. The Romans, like the Greeks, did not like to build tombs right in the middle of the city. They preferred to keep them outside of the city. The worlds of the dead and the worlds of the living needed to be separated. But over time, as Rome grew, it expanded around the mausoleum of Augustus Caesar. This is Augustus Caesar's altar of peace. It's marble with a series of carved reliefs. It commemorates his victory over Antony and Cleopatra in the Mediterranean, the Eastern Mediterranean. It's now housed inside of a museum in Rome. So now we'll talk a little bit more about Augustus's building projects and some of the Roman architectural discoveries that were being made in the late Republic and during the early Imperial period. Augustus Caesar said that he found Rome to be a city of brick, but he left Rome as a city of marble because of the numerous building projects that he started during his reign, replacing older brick buildings with fancier and newer marble buildings. Remember, these marble buildings were public buildings. Augustus Caesar did not want to build any building that was too nice for his own use. He wanted to build buildings for the people of Rome. This was part of his obligation to the people of Rome as the first citizen or the chief patron of the Roman people. So he built things like the altar of peace, which I showed on the previous slide, made of marble. He also made renovations to the Roman Forum, just like Julius Caesar did, and he completed the Theater of Marcellus, which construction was begun during Julius Caesar's reign as dictator. Augustus's chief architect was a man named Marcus Agrippa, shown here on this bust. Agrippa had been Augustus's general during the wars in which he took power over Rome. And the buildings built in this period and beyond were built according to the architectural principles of Vitruvius, a Roman engineer who studied Greek architecture. You can see him here on this side of the slide. Vitruvius wrote a book called De Architectura, which described the old Greek architectural styles, the Doric, Ionic, and Corinthian orders. He also described a new style, which is often called the composite order. Architects and archaeologists debate whether the composite order is really a separate order of architecture, if it's different enough than the Corinthian order, or if it's just a Roman version of the Corinthian order. Vitruvius also made a lot of engineering discoveries as well. He made improvements to Roman arches. Remember, Roman arches are true arches. They're not corbel arches like those built by earlier civilizations. Also, the Romans built domes. Domes, of course, are really just a series of arches on top of each other. And then the Romans developed concrete, which allowed them to make much more complex and much larger structures, especially domes. And the Romans also built on older Greek technologies, but expanded them and made them bigger and more extensive. The Greeks had used things like aqueducts and heating systems and Archimedes screws, but the Romans, including Vitruvius, took all of these systems and made them basically a lot larger, using their own technological innovations that they added to older Greek discoveries. We'll talk more about infrastructure a little bit later in the video. Here are the styles of columns that were used in Roman buildings. There's the very simple Tuscan order, which we talked about in a previous video. Then you have the famous Greek, Doric, Ionic, and Corinthian orders. Then you have the composite order, and there's some discussion over whether the composite order is really different enough to be considered a separate order from the Corinthian. It combines elements of both the Corinthian order and the Ionic order, namely the sort of ornate carvings and designs, the capital designs of the Corinthian order combined with the volutes of the Ionic order. And this composite order will become a favorite architectural style of the Romans. It'll be used on temples, government buildings, and triumphal arches. A good example, or really an earlier example of this composite order, is the triumphal arch of Titus, built in Rome in 81 CE to honor his and his father Vespasian's defeat of the Jewish rebellion. Also, the composite order, what makes it really unique and interesting is, like the Corinthian order, it has decorations that don't change based on what side you're looking at the column from. Some scholars say that the composite order should be called the italic order because it was very popular with the Romans. But I like the term composite order because it combines elements of the Corinthian and Ionic styles. Here are some examples of Roman arches and domes. Keep in mind that a dome is basically a type of arch. Here's the Pantheon of Rome. You can see an arch here, and then a much larger dome. This was the largest dome built by the Romans, and for centuries it was the largest dome built by humans. Before the Pantheon was built, the largest dome was actually in the bathhouse of Mercury in Naples. Here's a shot of the bathhouse of Mercury. Obviously, it has not been as well preserved as the Pantheon has. By the way, this is not the original Pantheon. This is the Pantheon that was built during the reign of Hadrian. The original Pantheon was designed and built by Marcus Agrippa about the time of the reign of Caesar Augustus, but it was destroyed, and it was rebuilt by a later emperor, Hadrian. Here are some more shots of the Pantheon. It was a temple meant for all Roman gods and goddesses. Also, it would be a place that the emperors could be worshipped because the emperors were basically considered to be gods. It was built originally during the reign of Augustus Caesar by Agrippa. It was destroyed, we think, by a fire. and it was rebuilt probably about 126 CE during the reign of Emperor Hadrian. And this dome was made thanks to concrete, which was much stronger than previous types of mortar and binding materials that were used. And the dome has a skylight, as you can see, and then it also has these rectangular designs, which are called coffers. So it's a very, very impressive site, and really a good example of the brilliance not only of Roman engineering, but also of architectural styles as well. And here you can see the facade of the Pantheon. It mentions Marcus Agrippa as its original builder. Hadrian kept the original facade style. He didn't want to take credit for rebuilding the Pantheon. He wanted to give honor to its original builder, which was Marcus Agrippa. So his name is on even the rebuilt version. So now we'll talk about Roman concrete. The Romans made concrete by mixing water, stone, and then volcanic ash. This ash acted as a natural cement, and the exact proportions or recipe for concrete was lost after the fall of Rome. Later civilizations used different types of mortars that were not nearly as reliable. They could hold things like bricks together, but they could not make the kind of complex domes, not until much later. Um, Even during the Renaissance architects did not have Roman-style concrete. True concrete was not rediscovered until late 1700s to mid 1800s CE, when chemists and civil engineers discovered how to create cement powder by mimicking volcanic processes, basically by heating certain types of lime to a very high temperature like a volcano would do. And they developed the concrete that we have today. By the way, the concrete we have today, it's not nearly as it'd be wrong to say it's not as durable as Roman concrete, but for example, modern day concrete doesn't do very well with salt. It has to have special treatments and special things mixed into it, but Roman concrete from 2,000 years ago handles, the salty air of the Mediterranean region a lot better. So in some cases you find old Roman buildings, they look really good because their concrete is very salt resistant, whereas modern concrete is not very salt resistant unless it's a special type that's designed to resist corrosion from salt. Now we'll switch back to discussing the first Roman imperial dynasty. There were several emperors during the Julio-Claudian dynasty. The first after Augustus, rather, was Tiberius, who reigned from about the year 14 CE to the year 37 CE. For context, this was the man who was emperor when Jesus Christ was running his ministry and when he was killed on the cross. Augustus Caesar was emperor when Jesus Christ was born. Tiberius was the adopted son of Augustus. He was a capable general, but seen as being a very harsh emperor and probably not as effective of a leader as Augustus Caesar, but not a terrible emperor. Some good things, some bad things. Augustus Caesar began the tradition of choosing an adopted son as emperor rather than having his natural children become emperor. And we believe that Augustus Caesar made this choice because he did not want to seem like a king. A king would pass on his rule to his biological sons, but by having Tiberius be his adopted son, be the next emperor, Augustus Caesar was not acting like a king. The two men, Augustus Caesar and Tiberius, had a very complex relationship. Augustus Caesar forced Tiberius to divorce his own wife and then to marry Augustus's daughter. Augustus's daughter, whose name was Julia, was not considered to be a very virtuous Roman woman, and Tiberius was very unhappy in his marriage to Julia, who Julia was actually eventually banished from the Roman Empire. There's also reports that Tiberius had certain perversions that we cannot mention on YouTube. They're of a sexual nature. But on the whole, he's generally seen as being a decent Roman emperor, but not as good as Augustus. After Tiberius comes Germanicus, also known as Caligula, who ruled from about 37 to 41 CE. He was Tiberius's nephew. Again, Tiberius choosing not his son, choosing somebody else to be the emperor. And he got this nickname Caligula from the term little boots, or Caligulae, because he wore Roman-style military sandals when he was a child. And everyone thought he was really cute. But he was certainly not cute when he was an adult. He had a pretty good start as an emperor, but a very bad finish. He killed and assassinated people he didn't like. He tried to make his horse a consul or a senator, and he was eventually assassinated by the Praetorian Guard and some senators. He had a very extravagant lifestyle, and it's thought that Caligula probably had some mental issues. After Caligula came Claudius. Claudius was actually the first Roman emperor to be born outside of Italy. He reigned from 41 to 54 CE, and he was a fairly successful Roman emperor. He brought Britain, or Britannia, into the Roman Empire. He was a very harsh ruler, though, and had his enemies assassinated. Definitely a better emperor than Caligula, probably about as good as Tiberius. After Claudius came Nero, who ruled from 54 to 68. Nero was the adopted son of Claudius, and he's the worst emperor of the Julio-Claudian dynasty, and probably the worst of all Roman emperors. And he helped to really bring down the Julio-Claudian dynasty. He was corrupt, he was violent. It was said that he engaged in all kinds of violent perversions, the things that I cannot mention on YouTube. He's also accused of starting a great fire in Rome in about 64 CE, and he ends up committing suicide in 68 to avoid execution. Nero's corruption and poor leadership led to a chaotic period called the Year of the Four Emperors, in which Nero, Galba, Otho, and Vitellius all ruled as emperor for a short period of time. Eventually, they were replaced by Vespasian, who became the next emperor after the Julio-Claudian dynasty came to a very crazy end. And of course, Roman emperors generally made adopted sons their heirs. They did not like to make their biological sons their heirs, because that would make the office of the emperor look too much like the office of a king. The primary documentary sources we have on these emperors are Suetonius's The 12 Caesars, and then Tacitus's Annals and Histories, and both are written about a half century after the events they describe. There's particularly some concern about the accuracy of Suetonius's account of the 12 Caesars. Some of the things he says about the private lives of these emperors, it'd be hard to verify these things with documentary or even archaeological evidence. So when you read particularly Suetonius, you take it with a grain of salt. And of course, on the left side of this slide is Suetonius, and on the right side is Tacitus. A couple of points about Nero, the man who brought down the Julio-Claudian dynasty. He was everything a Roman emperor was not supposed to be. As a young man, he was well educated. Elite Roman men were educated when they were boys, but much of his education did not stick with him. He was tutored by Seneca, a Stoic philosopher. Stoicism is all about controlling one's emotions and living very moderately and respecting other people. Stoicism, of course, is a Greek philosophical movement that was very popular amongst the Romans. It works very well with the Roman system of patronage and obligation. But Nero clearly did not heed the lessons from Seneca, his teacher. It was said, though, that Nero was a very skilled musician, that he could play multiple musical instruments, and Suetonius mentions that Nero would put on concerts that would last for hours and hours, and no one would be allowed to leave. And it was said that women would give birth during the concerts, and they wouldn't be allowed to leave. They would have to give birth to their babies in the theater. It was also said that men would play dead. They would pretend to be dead so they'd be carried out and taken away. He was seen as being very crazy and insane by a lot of Roman people. And he made matters worse by doing things like having his teacher commit suicide. He forced Seneca to commit suicide. He even tried to kill his own mother and eventually succeeded. He dealt with his enemies very harshly. He had people killed in really graphic and horrifying ways, which we'll talk about later. And he lacked basically the qualities of a good Roman emperor. He violated the obligations that the princeps had to the Roman people through his violence and through his perversions as well, which he did things that I can't mention on YouTube. If you want to know what Nero was doing, you can read Suetonius and read Tacitus. The question is there archaeological evidence for all these terrible things? The things in Nero's private life, it's a little bit harder to verify those with archaeological discoveries, but probably the worst thing that Nero did was his role in the Great Fire. He started a Great Fire in Rome in 64 CE so that he would have space to build a new palace for himself called the Domus Aurea, or Golden House. And we'll ask, is there evidence of this Great Fire based on the archaeology? The answer is yes, there is. Not as much as we'd like. We found evidence of iron gates burned, heavy iron gates that would not have just burnt and melted in a small fire. It would have needed to be a very big fire. Fires were very common in ancient Rome because of people cooking through open cook fires, buildings being made out of wood, very simple building codes and regulations. Rome did have building codes and regulations. They really tried to make things as fireproof as they could, but they didn't have modern sprinkler systems. They didn't have, fire engines and fire trucks the way we do today. So fires were often very destructive, and I think there's pretty good evidence that Nero caused the Great Fire of 64 CE. That way he could have more space for his Golden House palace. And it's also said that he fiddled, or he played a harp or musical stringed instrument while the city burned. Remember, he was said to be a talented musician. Here is the plan of the Domus Aurea, or the Golden House. It's much bigger and much more extravagant than previous Roman imperial palaces. Nero had no qualms about showing off his wealth and showing off the power he had as emperor that he really abused. He was, in many ways, the polar opposite of Augustus Caesar, who was emperor but tried to sort of cast himself as a man of the people. Nero did the exact opposite. He didn't seem to care at all what people thought of him. He had a strange, beard that didn't grow on his face. It was said that he was significantly overweight, almost to the point of being obese, as the previous bust showed him with a very, very round face. Roman men were supposed to be physically fit and trim. They were supposed to train for military service, and that's something that Nero had basically no interest in. And he also had no interest in following the customs of a Roman emperor, which meant living well, but not living like a king. Here are some reconstructions of what the Domus Aurea might have looked like. It was built from 64 to 68 CE, and it was called the Golden House because of all of the gold and ivory and jeweled decorations. It had, beautiful marble siding and fresco paintings. And it was said that Nero did things like burning people, particularly Christians, alive in the palace garden so that he could light his dinner parties and banquets. We'll talk more about Christianity and Christians in later videos. After Nero's death, most of the palace was demolished by the Flavian dynasty. They were just embarrassed by the Golden House. It was not the kind of palace that a Roman emperor ought to live in. It was too fancy. Other parts were also burned down as well. And there were other reasons that the Flavian dynasty tore down the Golden House. It was embarrassing, but it was also they needed space to build the Flavian amphitheater, better known as the Colosseum. And of course, they also would have wanted to legitimize the Flavian dynasty. And what better way to legitimize the Flavian dynasty than to tear down the palace of the last ruler of the Julio-Claudian dynasty. The Golden House was rediscovered during the Renaissance, and the site's remaining decorations have deteriorated due to the fact that part of the site was burned, part of the site was demolished, and then it was just forgotten about. By the way, my cat is making some noise in this video. I apologize. Here are some shots of what the Golden House looks like, and here are some archaeologists and workers working to restore the site. You can't visit the Golden House. It's been closed to the public due to the fact that it's falling apart. It's just too dangerous. They also want to try to preserve what's left of the site, and having too many visitors would be a threat to its preservation. But you can see that the Romans would build the basic, foundation of the building. Its frame would be built out of brick, but then they would overlay things with marble. Although most of the marble was taken out by the Flavians, and this is just what's left of the building. Basically, it's been gutted by fire and by demolition. So now we'll talk about some of the later Roman emperors, and we won't talk about every single one. We'll just talk about some of the most famous and significant. And there were good and there were bad emperors post Nero. Some of the good emperors are Vespasian, who I mentioned before, and Titus, his son, the Flavian dynasty. Both were considered to be good emperors. And then there was a period of 5 good emperors, which included Nerva, 96 to 98, Trajan, 98 to 117, Hadrian, 117 to 138, who I briefly mentioned before, Antonius Pius, 138 to 161, and then Marcus Aurelius, 161 through 180. We'll discuss a little bit of some of the things these emperors did in later parts of this video, but we're going to focus primarily on artifacts and everyday life after this. Some of the bad emperors included people like Domitian, who was also the Flavian dynasty, Commodus, son of Marcus Aurelius, Caracalla, who did some bad things and some good things, and then Maximinus Thrax. And this is taking us up to the crisis of the 200s. So several bad emperors in a row in the 200s put the Roman Empire onto a path of crisis, which we'll talk about in the next video. These good emperors, they ruled wisely, they championed good policies, they were successful military leaders, and then they practiced virtue and fulfilled their obligations as the princeps, as the emperor, as the chief citizen. The bad emperors would champion bad policies, they failed in their military campaigns, and they didn't practice virtue. They were undisciplined. They failed to live up to their title and their responsibilities as first citizen. It's also, good is a very relative term as well. A good Roman emperor would often do things that we would see as being horrifying or incredibly evil today. Vespasian is generally considered to be a good Roman emperor, but he was very brutal to his enemies, especially the Judeans, or the Jewish people who revolted in 66 and 70. Basically, the Jewish people were driven from their homelands in Judea and spread across the Roman Empire. Many were killed and enslaved, and this was also accomplished by his son Titus as well, who was involved in that campaign as well. And this is a bust of Vespasian in military garb, and this is a bust of Caracalla, one of the later emperors who was a bad emperor. This is a portion of the Arch of Titus that shows a relief of the Roman triumph after the destruction of Jerusalem, the capital city of the Jewish people. You can see the Roman soldiers carrying the menorah and other types of spoils of war that they captured from the temple. The triumph, of course, is just a military parade and celebration that would happen after a successful military campaign. And sometimes arches were built to commemorate these triumphs. Probably the most famous is the Arch of Titus, which we briefly looked at on an earlier slide. Here's the Arch of Titus again. It has inscriptions mentioning the Senate, how it's dedicated by the Senate to Vespasian, who led the campaign. Although it was finished by Titus, who was involved in the campaign. He was the son of Emperor Vespasian. And you can see people in the background here, which helps you get a scale of the size of this piece of monumental architecture. Here's the other side of the Arch of Titus. You can see that there is some coffers on this arch here. You can also see the composite order columns. This inscription here is not original. It was added in the early 1800s by 1800s CE by Pope Pius. He did restorative work on the Arch of Titus. He paid to have it restored to what it looked like more in Roman times. Here's a close-up of the coffers. You can see how ornate they are. And concrete allowed the Romans to make big, true arches, and these arches could then be decorated as well. Here is the Flavian Amphitheater, better known as the Colosseum. It was built by Vespasian and Titus, finished around the year 80 CE. If you look closely, you'll see that there's a variety of architectural styles used. The bottom side of or bottom level of the amphitheater has Doric columns, and then the second level has Ionic columns. You can see the volutes on the sides of the capitals, and then you can also see that there are Corinthian capitals, Corinthian order columns on the third level. And of course, the original Colosseum would have been completely closed in. Italy has a lot of earthquakes. Like many other parts of the Mediterranean, it's very seismically active, and it's been left as it is. They have not tried to rebuild the missing portions. This is what the Colosseum would have looked like during Roman times. You can see there's multiple levels. The most wealthiest people, the emperor and the Senate, they would sit in the bottom level so they could have the best view of the entertainment, the gladiatorial contests and things like that took place in the Colosseum. There may have also been awnings like this that could be pulled out to provide shade during the summertime. And poorer people would sit in the higher levels, the nosebleed seats or the cheap seats as we call them today. Here is a shot of the interior of the Colosseum. These are underground tunnels in which gladiators and athletes and people who are going to be performing would be moved underneath the stage. The Romans called this stage the arena. It's for the Latin word for sand. Sand was used to soak up the blood from the gladiators or from whoever was performing and getting hurt or being killed. And it was said that actually the arena could be filled with water to have mock naval battles even. So there were very, very amazing, but very violent types of entertainment going on in the Colosseum. But we'll talk more about entertainment in the Roman Empire a little bit later in the video. I'll briefly mention some Roman military campaigns that were taking place from 27 BCE to 235 CE. Remember, the Roman Empire was built on conquest, and there's still going to be quite a bit of conquest during this Pax Romana period, but it's going to be slower. The wealthy civilizations adjacent to the Mediterranean Sea had already been conquered. Egypt had already been conquered. Greece had already been conquered. The Carthaginians had already been conquered. Anatolia, what is now Turkey, had already been conquered. All of those areas were much wealthier than areas north of Rome, what is like northern Europe. So there was less of an interest in conquering those areas. Also, the people, like the Germanic tribes in what is now Germany, they proved to be very, very formidable foes, and so they just weren't worth the effort to the Romans. By about 111 or 117, rather, Common Era, the empire reached its largest point, and the emperors decided to focus more on defense with short-term campaigns. Now, defense was a lot easier than offense. It didn't require as many troops, but the problem was defense didn't bring revenue into the empire the way conquest did. These conquests, the gold, the treasures, the slaves that were taken, those not only caused the empire to grow, but they paid for the operations of the empire. They kept the empire's economy running. So there's going to be problems for the Roman Empire when they stop conquering. But conquest is harder as the empire gets bigger. You have to integrate those territories that you've conquered. So there's limits on how large the Roman Empire can grow. And also, soldiers on the frontier on defensive duty, they still need to be fed and paid, and they still need to receive their equipment, all of which is expensive. And if you're not bringing in booty and spoils of war, you're going to have to pay those soldiers and pay for their defensive duties in other ways, namely taxation. So what you see is that with fewer options for military glory, Romans on a whole become less interested in military service, which that's a serious problem. Roman society was based on military service. It was an important part of Roman obligations and Roman virtue, and it's going to lead to problems, especially from the 200s on. The image is on this slider of Hadrian's Wall, which separated Britannia from the Celtic Caledonian tribes of what is now northern England and Scotland. The Caledonians were fierce warriors, and there wasn't much treasure and things to take in that region, so the Romans decided to basically wall it off. Hadrian builds a wall in about 122 CE, and then a later wall is built about 20 years later. But the later wall, the Antonine Wall, is not nearly as impressive as Hadrian's Wall, which is much longer and it's made of stone. The later Antonine Wall is mostly made of earth. The Romans, especially Hadrian, probably not only was he trying to keep the Caledonians from invading, but he was also probably concerned that the Caledonians might inspire the Celtic peoples of Roman Britain, these conquered peoples, these provincials, to revolt against Rome, which actually happened in the 60s CE. There was the Boudiccan rebellion led by Boudica of the Celts, which we talked about in a previous video. Roman emperors in later years would not have wanted any kind of repeats like that, so that may have also been a reason why Hadrian's Wall was built. And this is the extent of the Roman Empire. At about 117 CE, they take territory all the way to the Persian Gulf, but these territorial gains won't last. The empire will begin to dissolve from like the later 200s on. We'll talk about that in future videos. So now we'll talk about the Roman military and the experience of Roman soldiers in the early empire, 27 BCE to 235 CE. Military service was not militia service anymore. Now it was a job. It was professional, regular army service. And it would have provided stable pay and food and clothing and health care for poor Roman citizens who were under the age of 45. You had to be under 45 if you were going to be in the Roman legions. You also had to be a citizen if you wanted to be in the Roman legions. Non-citizens could join the Roman military by serving in the navy or as auxiliaries, which we'll talk about a little bit later. Military service was very difficult no matter what branch of service you were in. The discipline was very harsh. There were restrictions on certain sexual relationships for most of the period. For example, legionaries for many years were not allowed to be married, and they were not allowed to have sexual relationships at certain points, although it often happened. This rule may have been actually designed to prevent sexual relationships between men, particularly between enlisted legionaries and officers. The Roman military worried that those relationships would be predatory and that the young legionaries would be taken advantage of. So non-citizens, they would join what was called the auxilia, and they would become auxiliaries. And the auxilia, these units would use a fusion of local and indigenous military traditions and weapons and armor, and they would fuse them with some Roman traditions as well. And of course, non-citizens could serve as sailors in the Navy as well. Non-citizens, after 25 years of service in the auxiliaries or 26 years in the Navy, they'd be given a diploma, like what we call a diploma today, and that diploma would give them citizenship. It would also exempt them from certain types of taxes. Veterans didn't have to pay certain taxes in the Roman Empire. And of course, citizens and non-citizens had to pay different types of taxes, so there were rewards for service beyond just becoming a citizen. There were tax breaks. At certain points, veterans would be given land to work as well. It just depended on what period or what time in Roman history we're discussing. And this is a relief that's believed to be from a Roman military barracks or camp in Tel Megiddo in Galilee, which is near Judea. Of course, Judea was where the Judean rebellion took place. And the Judean temple, of course, was destroyed, and the Jews were enslaved and then scattered around the Roman Empire in what was called the diaspora. Here are some images of auxiliaries. This is an auxiliary from Celtic territory, presumably from Britannia. He's wearing Celtic-style chainmail, but with a Roman helmet. Remember, Roman helmets were actually a fusion of Roman and Celtic technologies. He's also wearing closed-toed boots instead of sandals, and he's wearing short trousers. The Romans didn't really like trousers very much, but they recognized that trousers were very practical in cold areas like Britain and Northern Europe. So even some Roman soldiers actually wore trousers, copying the so-called barbarian auxiliaries. This is a copy of, not a copy, it's a version of a diploma. Auxiliaries would be given diplomas stating that they had served honorably in the Roman military, and this would give them the rights of citizens. This is a Roman or auxiliary cavalryman. You can see he's also wearing trousers. And a lot of the cavalry in the Roman military was auxiliaries, people from other parts of the empire who were not Roman citizens. A couple more examples of auxiliaries or modern reenactors dressed as auxiliaries. This is a Sagittary or Sagittarius, an archer. This reenactor is imitating a archer from the Middle East. You can see he has more Middle Eastern style equipment, but he's still part of the Roman military. This is a modern reenactor portraying an auxiliary either from the Celtic or from the Germanic provinces. Northern Europe, he has closed-toed boots and trousers and a oval-shaped shield rather than the rectangular Roman scutum shield. And this is a piece of a relief from the Column of Trajan, which features Roman archers or auxiliary archers fighting people called the Dacians in what is now Romania. Roman military training and military discipline was very harsh to the point of being brutal. Roman citizens, as you remember, could not be whipped, but Roman citizens in the legions could be whipped and beaten, and they were often forced to endure harsh corporal punishment for crimes. They trained constantly. They trained first with wooden weapons and worked their way up to actual swords, and of course injuries and wounds in training would have been very common. And the discipline that they were expected to live under as soldiers was very harsh. The Romans really copied a lot of their military training from the Spartans, the Spartan agoge or agoge system. The Romans, of all the Greek peoples, they probably liked the Spartans the best because the Spartans were the most militaristic of all the Greeks. Here are some images of Roman soldiers and then modern reenactors dressed as Romans on the march. And Roman soldiers or Roman legionaries were expected to march 25 Roman miles per day, carrying about 80 plus pounds of gear, sometimes a little bit more. They would march along these Roman roads, though, which definitely made marching easier. But either way, it was a very hard life, and an auxiliary would deal with a lot of the same challenges of military service. But they would have to put up with this sort of life for 25 years if they wanted to become a citizen. The Romans, in terms of medicine, were actually pretty advanced for the standards of the day. Because it's a militaristic society, their physicians and their surgeons had a lot of experience dealing with wounds. And Roman society emphasized health and medicine because you needed to know medicine in order to take care of wounded soldiers and injured soldiers. So they were actually in many ways very good at treating wounds especially. Perhaps the most famous physician of the Roman civilization was Claudius Galenus, or Galen. Technically, he was of Greek ancestry. He was from the eastern part, the kind of the Greek part of the Roman Empire. And he studied previous Greek physicians like Hippocrates, and he built upon their knowledge really through experimentation, working with patients. He also did dissections and vivisections of animals, cutting animals open while they were still alive so that he could see how their anatomy functioned. So the Romans built significantly on Greek knowledge of medicine in terms of treatment of wounds and then in terms of anatomy. And of course, Galen's discoveries were passed on to Roman military surgeons and then of course to civilian physicians as well. And many of Galen's anatomical principles were studied for centuries after the fall of the Roman Empire. Here are some examples of Roman medical instruments that have been found. As you can see, there's things like bone saws used for amputations. There's forceps that would be used to extract arrows from wounds. There's scalpels. There's also what the Romans would have called spatulas, which would be used to apply salves and poultices to keep wounds from becoming infected. The Romans didn't have germ theory. They didn't know about microorganisms that made people sick. They believed that people got sick or got infections from an imbalance of humors. But they did, through practical kind of trial and error, discover that certain substances could prevent the spread of infection. It could help wounds heal more easily. So even though Roman medicine seems very primitive to us today, there were some important discoveries being made. But one last thing, as you're looking at these tools, keep in mind that there were no anesthetics during this period in the modern sense. A Roman patient might be given wine to drink to make him intoxicated so he would feel less, but they don't have ether and chloroform or sodium pentothal the way modern physicians do. So these operations, these surgical procedures would have been extremely painful, especially things like amputations. So now we'll talk about how life varied for Roman people based on where in the empire they lived. The Roman Empire was broken up into a collection of provinces. This is the Roman Empire at its territorial height at about 117 AD. The provinces in pink are senatorial provinces, and the provinces in green are imperial provinces. It's estimated that at its height, the Roman Empire had between 50 and 90 million inhabitants, and that it may have held as many as 20 to 40% of the world's population at this time in history. I talked about this in a previous video, but these population estimates, they vary widely because the methodology used by each censor, could change quite a bit, so that's why the numbers fluctuate. But either way, this is a very large empire in terms of territory and large in terms of people. The senatorial provinces, shown in pink, were ruled by a proconsul, who was basically a governor appointed by the Senate. Usually the proconsul was often a retired consul who would take on governorship, proconsulship, kind of as a retirement job. All of these provinces in pink were ruled by a proconsul except for Italia. Italia was ruled directly by the Senate. The green provinces were called the imperial provinces, and they were ruled by the emperor, not by the Senate. So the emperor has more control of more territory than the Senate does in the Roman Empire. And this system was created by Augustus Caesar, and there were some modifications as time went on. Generally speaking, freeborn citizens of Rome were born in Italia or in one of the other senatorial provinces. It was pretty rare for a citizen to be born in a imperial province. It did happen, though, if that citizen's parents were citizens themselves, or at least their father had to be a citizen by Roman law if that person were to be born a citizen. Provincials, non-citizens, had ways of becoming citizens, military service, decrees by the Senate. Basically, they could be gifted citizenship. Over time, though, more non-citizens were allowed to become citizens. The Edict of Caracalla in 212 CE made all freeborn Romans in the bounds of the empire citizens, even if they were from the provinces. This change was made by Caracalla not out of the goodness of his heart, though. It was made so that the tax base could be increased. There were certain types of taxes that citizens paid, and there were certain types of taxes that non-citizens, provincials, paid. And by making all of the provincial males into citizens at that point in Roman history, it was a way to get increased revenues. Remember, as the Roman Empire became less offensive and more defensive, they had to rely on taxation to pay for the military and to pay for infrastructure and government systems. So what you see is that citizenship becomes easier across the span of Roman history, but the citizen's power shrinks and the citizen's responsibilities increase. So being a citizen in earlier part of Roman history, like during the Republic, there's much more rights for a citizen, but then during the Empire, more people are allowed to be citizens, but they have fewer rights and they have a lot more obligations, particularly when it comes to taxation. So now we'll talk about daily life for just regular civilian people in the provinces. We'll focus on the senatorial provinces first. And we're going to use the Pompeii site as our kind of case study, our archaeological example. Pompeii was a small town in central Italy of about 16,000 inhabitants. By V. Gordon Child's definitions, though, Pompeii would be considered a city. It had enough of a local culture, it had social stratification, it had monumental architecture. You can review our first two videos in this course if you want to find out more about Child's qualifications. But archaeological research in Pompeii is much easier. Archaeological excavation is much easier in Pompeii because the city was destroyed very quickly, or not destroyed, but completely covered by the Mount Vesuvius volcanic eruption. It was not a continuously inhabited site the way Rome was and is. So you can really capture what life was like in the fall of 79 CE when Pompeii was covered by ash and pyroclastic flow from the Mount Vesuvius volcano. So it's you might say frozen in time, which is an excellent opportunity for archaeologists to learn more about daily life for the ancient Romans. And of course, the images on this slide are 3D reconstructions of what the Pompeii buildings and city streets would have looked like. Here is a shot of Pompeii as it is today after it's been excavated. Work to excavate Pompeii began in the 1700s and 1800s CE after it was discovered by accident by an Italian farmer. You can see the Roman roads are still in very good shape. You can see the sidewalks as well are raised up so that people walking on the sidewalks wouldn't be stepping in dirt and mud and all kinds of other filth and things that would have been on the roads. You can see the buildings are made of brick, but they would have had nicer buildings would have been sided in marble, but cheaper buildings would have just been made of brick with concrete plaster on the exterior to cover up the brick. And so it has very good infrastructure, as you can see. Wealthy patricians lived in very nice houses. They're typically called villas. Villas can be built inside urban centers, but they can also be built out in the country as well. What you'll see is that over time, more and more Romans, wealthy Romans, are going to move out of the cities and into the country, which will have some serious consequences for the development of the Roman Empire. Poorer people, however, they did not live in villas. They lived in basically large apartment buildings called insulae that were of varying quality based on what the various plebeian could afford. The homes of patricians, these villas, they had amenities like private toilets and fountains so that the families could take good care of themselves and be comfortable. Plebeians often didn't have access to things like private toilets. They had to use public toilets, and they had to use public fountains, which would have, of course, been of varying quality because they're being used by a lot more people. Patricians would have had meals cooked in their homes, in their own kitchens, often cooked by slaves, and then they would have eaten them in dining rooms in their much larger villas. Poorer Romans would have probably eaten at what were like restaurants or food stands in the bottom floor of their insulae apartment buildings. Both classes, though, would have gone to bathhouses. It's just the quality of the bathhouse they would have attended would have varied, and the kind of services they would have received at the bathhouse would have varied. But the eruption of Mount Vesuvius and the ash, it sealed out the air, it covered these buildings, and it preserved the artwork, it preserved the material culture, the possessions of the people that live in Pompeii, and it preserved the people of Pompeii itself, as we'll see later in this video. This is a partially restored Roman villa in Pompeii. You can see that it's made of brick and stone with a tile roof, and it has what are basically Tuscan-style columns. It's a multi-story villa. Some villas have multiple stories, others do not, but they usually have a garden or courtyard of some kind where the family can get some fresh air. This is actually slaves' quarters, we think, in a nicer villa in Pompeii. It's basically a storage room full of pottery and then a small bed. The bed would have been made of natural materials like cloth and wood, but it's been petrified by the ash, turned to stone. Pompeii featured a series of public toilets. If you look closely on this plan of the city of Pompeii, you can see the dots are where toilets were built. These toilets were supposed to be connected to the sewer system. The sewers would wash away the waste that was produced by their users, but recent scholars think that a lot of these toilets were not actually connected to the sewers, and people just basically did their business in the toilet, and then the night soil, as it's called, had to be taken away by workers. While these toilets would have been a lot cleaner than people just doing their business anywhere they wanted and dumping into the streets, they certainly were probably pretty dirty. There would have been graffiti, there would have been a lack of cleanliness, there would have been like workers cleaning them. These were public toilets used by a lot of people each day. This cartoon on the right-hand side of the slide illustrates how dirty these public toilets would have been. These objects here actually are sticks with sponge attached. The Romans would use these sticks to clean themselves after doing their business. Not very sanitary at all. They would dip them in salt water, and people might have even shared them. Very, very dirty, to be sure. But certainly better than just doing your business out in the open. Here are some of the fountains in Pompeii. This is a public fountain, pretty simple. The water would have continually rushed, being fed by pipes and aqueducts. The Romans typically made their pipes out of lead, which of course leads to a lot of problems, but they had access to reasonably clean water thanks to these aqueduct and pipe systems, even poorer people who would come every day and fill their jars with water. That was usually a task that was done by women. This is a much nicer fountain in a private home. Wealthier families could afford to have water piped into their own fountains, so they didn't have to go share a public fountain with the plebeians. This is an illustration of how the Roman aqueduct system worked. The Romans would have used their famous arches to pipe water in from a spring of some kind. Pompeii, its water supply came from a mountain spring in the Apennine Mountains to the east of the town. The water would be piped into a reservoir, and then it would be sent down lead pipes. The reservoir would have pressurized the water so that there would be continuous flow into things like fountains and toilets. And then there would be sewers as well. Sewers theoretically were supposed to be connected to the toilets, and they were supposed to be connected to the roads, and they would catch, water that would spill out of the fountains. Also, wealthier people's homes, their fountains would be connected with lead pipes to the sewers as well, and the sewers would empty either into a river or they would empty into the ocean. There was no water treatment plants where the water was treated. The Romans did not have a concept of germ theory. But this water aqueduct system still gave Romans access to water that, by the standards of the day, was very, very clean. And this is some reconstructions, partial reconstructions of the reservoir and the aqueducts that served Pompeii. As I mentioned before, the city got its water from a spring in the Apennine Mountains to the east of the city. This is an underwater aqueduct and reservoir in Naples. The Romans often built underwater aqueducts as well, but these aqueducts are much more difficult and expensive to build than to build over land aqueducts like we saw on the previous slide. This is actually probably the most expensive aqueduct system ever built by the Romans, is this underground system in Naples. This is a path of how the sewers moved through the city of Pompeii. The sewers would have captured stormwater, but they also would have captured the other types of wastewater we discussed on a previous slide. Another essential part of Roman infrastructure was their bathhouses, or thermae, as they called them. The Roman culture put a significant emphasis on personal hygiene, and the average Roman did not have indoor plumbing in their homes. These insulae apartment buildings did not have those amenities typically. So poorer people would go to bathhouses to get clean. Wealthier people went to bathhouses as well, but they went to bathhouses more as a way of entertainment or diversion. And these bathhouses were used by all classes. Wealthier people would have gone to nicer bathhouses than poorer people. They could afford to attend bathhouses that had more amenities. Some bathhouses were fed by aqueducts and water pipes. Other bathhouses were built over natural springs and were fed by natural springs. Some of those springs were hot springs and would provide heated water to the baths. Baths that did not have hot springs had heating systems in their floors, in their basements. These heating systems were, of course, powered by wood that was burned, and then the heat from the burning wood would go up into the floor and heat the water. Basically a form of radiant heat. In addition to bathing, guests at bathhouses would pay for services like massages, haircuts. They would pay people called hair pluckers who would pull people's hair out using tweezers in more sensitive regions. The hair pluckers, it was said, they would signal their profession by crying out and making strange noises, imitating the kind of sound a person would make when they were having their hair plucked out. In addition to services like that, in addition to bathing and steam rooms, the Romans also used the bathhouses as places for social gatherings. Larger bathhouses often had athletic fields for athletic competitions. The Romans, like the Greeks, liked to play sports. Larger bathhouses also would have had libraries and maybe even had restaurants as well. And some bathhouses also would have been brothels, where there would have been prostitutes. Bathhouses were typically segregated, though. Males and females either went to different bathhouses or went to different sections of the bathhouse. Obviously, this rule did not apply for prostitutes who would have interacted with male customers in the bathhouse. So this place was a social place of not just getting clean, but of social gatherings as well. It's a lot like what the gymnasium was for the Greeks. The gymnasium, of course, is a place where people gathered together to play sports and to talk politics and to read and to study. People did those things at bathhouses in addition to just getting clean. And of course, some bathhouses were fed by natural springs. Others had to have water piped in. And this is a plan for a larger Roman bathhouse. It features a exercise yard that's for men only. Remember, these bathhouses were typically segregated by gender. Men would play sports in the exercise yard, and then they would go and bathe or have other services after they'd finished playing sports. A lot like a modern day gym, essentially. And the Romans typically played sports naked as well, just like the Greeks did. And here is the interior of the bathhouse at Pompeii. It's a place that people would have gone not just to get clean, but to socialize and to have a good time as well. So these bathhouses were important parts of the Roman infrastructure, along with aqueducts and fountains and toilets, but they were also social gathering places as well. And this is a shot of a spring-fed bath in Bath, England. This spring-fed bath, the water's pretty warm, but you actually can't swim in it anymore. There are pathogens that will make you very sick. There's actually what are called brain-eating amoebas living in the water in the baths at Bath, England. So you can visit the baths, but you can't actually use them. Other Roman baths you can actually use. The bathhouse shown at the beginning of this video, which is in Algeria, is still in use today. So now we'll discuss the types of housing that Romans used during the early imperial period. This is the insula, or insulae plural. It's basically an apartment building. These were the buildings that poorer Romans lived in. The bottom floor had shops and kitchens and restaurants where the people would have sold goods or they would have eaten. Then they would have lived in the upper floors. And in modern day apartment buildings, usually the most expensive floors, the penthouse, is the top floor. But for the Romans, the first floor was the most expensive and the most desirable. It was the safest floor in the event of a fire. You could escape more quickly from the first floor than from the top floor. Fires are very common in Roman cities. Also, earthquakes were common. If there was an earthquake, you could escape the building much more quickly from the bottom floor than from the top floor. And it was, a more desirable place to live on the bottom floor because it was safer. These buildings did not have staircases. Well, they had staircases. They did not have elevators. There were no like safety features. People often fell out of windows. So these insula were not very nice places to live in general. But this is where the average Roman plebeian lived if they lived in a city. And Pompeii has many insulae. And the insulae, obviously, they varied in quality. Some were nicer than others. There were slums in Roman cities, areas that were poorer and more dangerous or had a higher crime rate, where the buildings were not as nice. As I mentioned, the cheapest apartments were on the top floor, which is the opposite of today. And these insulae often collapsed or caught on fire, and people often fell from windows. So it could be very dangerous living in these apartment buildings. And also, many of them did not have their own toilets or fountains. People would have had to have gone to public toilets and fountains. This is an example of the western insulae of Pompeii. As you can see, it's made primarily out of brick and stone. You can see the Roman arches, and you can see the different types of plaster that are being used. The brick and stone would have been plastered over and then painted. They didn't use things like marble to make insulae. Much too expensive. Wealthier Romans in cities could live in private homes called villas. Villas varied in size and quality based on the wealth of the owner. Smaller villas were built in cities. This is the kind of villa that might have been built in a town like Pompeii. It has a courtyard in the back where the family could exercise by themselves, could get some fresh air. And then in the front area is the atrium, and sometimes atriums featured a pool of some kind, which could be used for washing or just to look at. The atrium is where the owner of the villa, the patron, would meet with his clients for social events and things like that. Villas also featured a triclinium, which is basically a dining room filled with couches, usually 3 couches. The Romans liked to eat while reclined, just like the Greeks. And we also see that there's the tablinum, which was basically an office where the master, the paterfamilias, would do his business and do his work. And as I mentioned before, what you'll see is that over time, wealthier Romans are going to move out of the cities. They're going to move out to villas in the country, which are much larger, and they would live out on basically estates called latifundias, which are basically land estates that were maintained often by slave labor, slave agricultural labor. This is a modern reconstruction of a rural villa surrounded by a latifundia. You can see that there's vineyards, olive trees, wheat fields. The land would have been maintained either by slaves or by poor plebeian people who would have been the clients of the patron who owned the villa. This is one of the villas at Pompeii. It's called the Villa of Mysteries. It's called that because of the amazing frescoes that have been found at the site. The site has also been partially restored as well. You can see the restoration work, the adding of a new tile roof to mimic the tile roof that would have been on the house before it was covered in ash. That work is still ongoing. This is the plan of the Villa of Mysteries. It has a garden courtyard in the back, and then it has an atrium for more public gatherings, and then buildings around the side. Here are some of the frescoes from the Villa of Mysteries, and they were very well preserved because of the ash. The ash basically kept air out, kept them from oxidizing and fading with time. But there has been some restoration work done on the Villa of Mysteries frescoes to recreate what they would have looked like before the destruction of Pompeii. As you can see, the art is very good. It's of very good quality. This would have been these frescoes would have been very expensive, and they highlight the wealth of the patron person who owned this this home. The Romans also decorated their homes with mosaics as well. The Romans excelled at the use of mosaics, which were made from small tiles embedded into a concrete type substance. The Greeks were actually probably the people who invented mosaics, but the Romans really took the creation of mosaics to a whole other level, and they may have employed a lot of Greek mosaic artists early in their history. The Romans were interested in mosaics and in art in a different way than the Greeks were. Wealthy Greek people who could afford to have art made typically did not have art made for their home. They would instead have that art made in a public place so they could show off their wealth to the community as a whole. But Romans generally preferred, if they had the money for to show their wealth, they would show it in their home. This is not emperors, this is just people in like the patrician class. Because they had their clients, they had people in their homes every day, and having wealth in their homes would have showed their clients how wealthy they were, and it would have caused the clients to trust them more. And some of the best preserved mosaics that we have are from Pompeii because of how quickly the city was covered by volcanic ash. And this is an example of an atrium mosaic. This is a Beware of Dog mosaic from Pompeii. Basically, the inscription says to watch out for this dog, and the dog is shown on a leash with a chain. We see this style of mosaic pretty frequently in Pompeii and in other sites, other Roman sites. This is an Alexander at Issus mosaic. It's at the House of the Faun in Pompeii. Alexander, of course, was not Roman, he was Greek, but the Romans had what we call a love-hate relationship with the Greeks. They loved many elements of Greek culture, Alexander the Great would have been someone they would have looked up to and been inspired by, even as they took over the Greek city-states and deprived them of their freedom. So we see this as a mosaic of Alexander the Great fighting the Persians at Issus. This is actually from Sicily. It's a mosaic of women playing sports. This mosaic doesn't show the women in the nude the way men would have. It shows them in their underwear. So if women played sports, they were not completely naked the way men were, we think, in Roman society. So now we'll talk about how Roman people like to look, how they like to dress themselves and attire themselves, based on the material culture we have recovered from their sites. We know that male Roman citizens, they wore togas. They also wore tunics as well. Working class men would have worn tunics. Wealthier men would have worn togas, because a toga is not the kind of clothing you wear if you're a working person. It's hard to move in. In colder times, though, wealthier men would have probably worn a tunic under their toga. Occasionally, Romans living in colder regions would wear trousers, although the Romans generally looked down on trousers and thought that they were barbaric. They were what barbarians wore. In terms of colors, white and purple were popular colors with wealthy people. Having white clothing was a sign of status, that you were not a working person, because white is very hard to keep clean. And purple, of course, purple dye was very expensive. At certain points in Roman history, senators wore white togas with purple lining around the edges. Togas were typically made of wool, but they also could be made of linen. And the wealthiest of Romans might have had togas made out of silk as well. Silk, of course, came from China along the Silk Road. Romans knew about silk and bought it, but it would have been very, very expensive. Women typically wore long dresses called stolas, and they would have worn cloaks called pallas. The idea was women should dress modestly in Roman culture. They should not show too much skin off. They typically were more covered up than men as well. They did not leave home with their heads uncovered, especially women who were married, we think, definitely followed this rule. Also, it's worth noting that women who were engaged in prostitution would wear togas instead of wearing typical women's clothing, as a way to symbolize that they were prostitutes. And also remember that only Roman citizens were allowed to wear togas. Non-citizens could not wear togas. That was something they had to earn by becoming citizens. Women typically wore their hair long, and they would style it with curls and things like that. They also wore makeup and often dyed their hair. Blonde was a very popular color. There's reports that Roman women would dye their hair blonde using all kinds of chemicals, or even things like bird feces. How effective these things were, it's hard to say. Modern hair dyes often contain ammonia, so perhaps they were secretly, without realizing it, using ammonia to dye their hair. Men typically wore their hair short in what we often call the Caesar cut today, a very simple hairstyle that was very short and wouldn't have gotten in the way of their face, probably because Roman society was very militaristic. Shorter hairstyles were probably very desirable from the beginning for men who were in battle and were wearing helmets and things. Typically, Roman men were clean shaven. This slide is kind of an oddity because it actually shows a Roman man with a short beard in a period where beards are not very popular. This is from Pompeii. Beards really don't become popular amongst people in the Roman Empire until about the 200s CE. For footwear, men and women typically wore sandals, and they might wear closed-toed boots in colder regions, places like Britannia, for example. And of course, this is a fresco from Pompeii showing off Roman styles from about 79 CE. You can see the man is wearing a toga. He is holding a scroll, suggesting that he's literate. His wife is also holding a tablet and a stylus, basically a Roman writing implement, suggesting that she might actually be literate as well, which is interesting because women were usually not educated in the way that men were in Rome. It's a patriarchal society. Here's a diagram of how the toga was folded. It's, as you can see, it's not something that you would wear if you were doing a lot of physical manual labor. You would probably just wear a tunic if you were involved in manual labor. And of course, only citizens of Rome could wear togas. This is what women's clothing would have looked like: the stola dress with a palace cloak over the head. And this is probably a senator with a reddish-purple stripe on his toga, symbolizing that he is a senator. Here are some examples of Roman shoes that have been found, various types of sandals. Closed-toed boots were also found as well, particularly in colder parts of the Roman Empire, places like Britain. This is a modern recreation of what a Roman military boot in places like Britannia, what it would have looked like. They also wore sandals in warmer regions. They had hobnails on the bottom. Basically, these are like cleats, like modern day athletic cleats that athletes wear. This would have allowed the soldiers to have better traction on muddy battlefields. And we know a lot about Roman clothing, not just from finding examples of fragments of Roman clothing and shoes and things, but by looking at their sculptures as well. On the far left is an adult woman with her head covered by the palace cloak. And then on the center left is a young woman, perhaps a teenage girl, probably unmarried. Her head is not covered. And then we see various types of togas. The center right is of the Emperor Nerva from 96 to 98 CE. And then on the far right is Emperor Marcus Aurelius from almost a century later. The styles have not changed too much for the men, except that Marcus Aurelius has a beard, whereas Nerva does not. Beards, as I said, become kind of popular in about the 200s CE. Women's styles change quite a bit more throughout the Roman Empire period, as is pretty common with women's fashion versus men's fashion in the present, which actually is going to be important later, as you'll see towards the end of the video. Here are some examples of Roman razor and shears. This pair of shears is actually from Roman Egypt, and it's decorated with Egyptian iconography. These are the shears that would have been used to give haircuts and things like that. You're only going to be able to do very simple styles with equipment like this. And with a razor like this, it's no wonder that beards became popular for Roman men in the 200s. Here are some examples of other devices used in the daily life of Roman people: a comb and a pair of tweezers and a cosmetic bottle. Tweezers were used to pluck out unwanted hairs. This was something that both men and women did. Combs would have been used to keep the hair neat, and women would have used bottles to hold various types of cosmetics. They used things like dyes and powders for their eyes and things like that. They also used ground up chalk or lead to make their skin look lighter, which of course using lead on your skin is a very bad idea. Although the Romans we don't think that they were aware of this, the negative effects of lead. Of course, we talk about the food. Food's an important part of daily life. The Romans ate a very varied diet, but bread, olive oil, and wine were the foundation of their diet. It's it's often called the Mediterranean Trinity. And this, of course, this diet of bread, olive oil, and wine was especially important for the poor, who could not afford as many different types of foods. Wealthier Romans ate bread, olive oil, and wine as well, but they could also afford meats and fish, and they could afford spices imported from Asia. They also would have used seasonings like garum, which is a fermented fish sauce that's a lot like modern-day Worcestershire sauce. The image on this slide is scored bread, or panem, as the Romans would have called it. It's from Pompeii. It's been petrified by the ash, which is why it looks green. It's not rotten, it's just turned to stone. But what's interesting is you can see the inscription from the baker on one of the slices of bread. The Romans typically only ate one full meal. They had two smaller meals. They had ienticum, or breakfast, which is a very simple meal, usually bread soaked with a little bit of wine and possibly some fruit. Then they would eat the big meal of the day called cena, which is basically a mid-afternoon lunch or dinner meal in which more bread would be eaten along with vegetables, meat, or fish if they could afford it. The diet would have varied significantly based on the level of wealth of the Romans. Then there was the vesperna, or the supper, which was a small late night meal, usually like leftovers and things from the cena. For beverages, there would have been wine, of course. In certain parts of the empire, cerveza, or beer, was drunk as well. Places like Egypt, beer was popular. Beer also would have been popular in the far northern parts of the Roman Empire. Upper class Romans typically ate reclining in their dining rooms, which were called the triclinium, because of the three couch setup like you see on this image. And while they ate, they would have had musicians performing for them, dancers dancing for them. They would have been attended by their slaves. There's evidence to suggest that wealthier Romans suffered from obesity and various diseases that people get from eating a very large diet. Interestingly, though, Romans actually had pretty good teeth compared to other ancient civilizations. This is probably due to the fact that there was very little sugar in their diet. Most of their sweeteners were made either from honey or from fruit. They didn't use a lot of honey and a lot of other kinds of sweeteners, so their teeth are not nearly as bad as the teeth from remains of other civilizations. Here are some frescoes of dinner parties. These are from Herculaneum and Pompeii. They show both men and women eating and drinking together. This one on the left is interesting because it shows the male reclined figure holding what looks like a drinking horn of some kind. Typically, Romans drank from very shallow wine bowls. They didn't typically use horns like this. So it's possible he might be drinking a different beverage, perhaps mead. Mead, of course, is a type of beverage made from fermented honey. And the Romans allowed women to attend their dinner parties. They weren't like the Greeks that kept the dinner parties gender segregated, where only men could attend. And this is a Roman food stand from Pompeii. The pictures, these frescoes here, might be the menu of the restaurant. We see ducks and chickens. There's a dog here. I don't think the dog is on the menu. This is actually probably a beware of dogs sign, or perhaps it's a sign of the mascot of the restaurant. But what would have happened is these circular areas would have held, they would have been used to keep food warm, and then ovens would have been used to cook food like bread, for example. And here's another view of the food stand. You can see more frescoes. We also have found bones, animal bones, especially duck bones around the site, suggesting that this restaurant served duck to its customers. Snail shells are also found nearby, so it's possible they were serving an early Roman version of escargot at this restaurant. And this restaurant would have catered primarily to poorer people who did not eat as much meat as wealthier people. Pottery was used to store food and liquids and all sorts of things in Pompeii and really throughout the Roman Empire. Pottery was like the Tupperware of the ancient world, not just for the Romans, but for the Greeks and many other civilizations. Some pottery is very simple and with very minimal decorations. Other Roman types of pottery are painted and glazed. It really just comes down to the wealth of the purchaser, if they could afford a very ornate piece of pottery, if they bought something simpler. The Romans generally painted their ceramics after they were glazed, after they had been covered with a glaze, a hot glaze. Because of this, the paint would have worn off over time with use. This style is called the terra sigillata or terra sigillata. And of course, there's variations in pottery style across the empire. based on local cultures and their own pottery kind of traditions. The Romans also imported Greek-style pottery, variations of the older red and black figures, which were made because of different styles of clay being used. We talked about that in a previous video about Greek pottery. The greatest contribution the Romans made to ceramic art were their pottery reliefs, basically three-dimensional characters and designs on their pottery. On the whole, though, Roman pottery is not as colorful as Greek pottery, largely because it was painted after glazing, and they generally didn't use multiple different types of clay in the same vessel the way the Greeks did. And this slide just shows some amphorae, or storage jars from Pompeii. These would have been used to store water, most likely. There were different types of pottery to store wine in. There were different types of pottery to store grains in. It just varied based on what they were holding, and then, of course, the amount of money the purchaser was willing to pay. These are some examples of some decorative Roman pottery. Decorative in the sense that they have decorations. They still would have been used for very practical purposes. These are probably moratoriums, as they're called. Moratoriums were basically used as giant food bowls. The one on the left features Nike, the goddess of victory. It's also been partially reglazed. The shiny areas have been reglazed, and the more lighter colored areas are the unglazed pots. They use mostly red clay in Roman pottery. They don't use the different types and colors that you see in Greek-style pottery nearly as frequently. And these are both at a museum in Metz, France. On the right-hand side, we see another Roman pot, possibly with some Celtic kind of designs on it. Made in France, in Gaul, it makes sense. Local traditions, local tastes would have affected the Roman pottery made in that region. Some more examples of Roman ceramics. This is Aeneas carrying his father Anchises out of Troy. This is a scene from Virgil's Aeneid. The Aeneid was a very popular story thanks to Virgil, and the Romans had ceramics made in its memory as well. On the right-hand side is an oil lamp featuring two gladiators fighting. You can see the carbonization from the oil that would have been burnt in this lamp. And this figurine is from Pompeii, but this oil lamp is not from Pompeii. It's at a museum in Cologne, Germany. So now we can talk about entertainment in ancient Rome, specifically in Pompeii. The Romans were party animals. They liked entertainment. They had Greek-style theater, which we talked about in previous videos. They had athletic contests, and they had chariot racing, all of which were done by the Greeks, and all of which remained popular in the Roman Empire. But far more so than the Greeks, the Romans really enjoyed things like public executions and blood sports, probably because the Roman society was much more militaristic. They would stage animal hunts and blood sports like gladiatorial fights. They had formal gladiatorial fights since at least 265 BCE, and possibly earlier. There's debate as to who invented gladiatorial competitions. Some scholars think the Etruscans invented gladiatorial fights. They may have been part of Etruscan funerary banquets. Others think that Greeks living in Italy, Magna Graecia, invented gladiatorial contests, and the Romans were just copying the Greeks. But either way, the Romans will take gladiatorial competitions to a whole new level. In addition, they'll have hunters called venators that will kill exotic animals like lions and tigers and leopards and rhinoceroses and things for the entertainment of the crowds. Wealthy Romans would pay for festivals called ludi, in which gladiators would fight each other, venators would kill animals, people would be executed, and then all of the plebeian audience would receive food and drink as they watched the fights or the races or the executions. And these ludi, these festivals were very expensive. A lot of patricians almost went bankrupt putting them on. But this was part of the system of obligation. Patrons were supposed to spend a lot of money to entertain the clients, the plebeians. And this, of course, was derisively called bread and circuses. That was all that the poor supposedly cared about. These festivals had strong civil and religious connotations. Sacrifices were also made at these ludi, these festivals. The meat from the sacrificial animals would be given to the crowds. So in addition to bread, they would also have meat. And of course, poor people did not eat nearly as much meat as the patricians, as the wealthy people did. And it's estimated that at least 1/3 of the days in the Roman calendar were spent in festivals. Here are some examples of how the Romans portrayed gladiators and venators. This is a venator or hunter fighting what looks like a leopard. And here we see different types of gladiators. There were several different types of weapons that gladiators used. Here are gladiators fighting each other while a judge oversees the fights. The judge will strike any gladiator that tries to run away or escape the fight. Here is some important information about the gladiators. Gladiators were a type of slave. A Roman citizen that wanted to become a gladiator would be giving up his freedom and his citizenship to become a gladiator. Basically, he'd be trading his freedom for the glory of being a gladiator. Gladiators were seen as professional athletes, but they were also not free people. Generally, though, most gladiators were non-Romans. They were captives taken in war, people who already had military training and training with weapons. And you can see the non-Roman influence on gladiatorial combat. Various types of weapons are used. There's the Thracian gladiator that uses Thracian-style weapons and tactics, for example. Gladiators fought with swords and shields and helmets. Others were more lightly armed and used things like tridents and nets. Also, some gladiators fought on horseback as well. Even though gladiators were often celebrated and they were the professional athletes of ancient Rome, they were often regarded as being kind of the male equivalent of prostitutes. You might like a gladiator and you might cheer for them, but you wouldn't have dinner with them. When gladiators fought, they would fight to the death. They would, if they did not kill their opponent, they could leave their wounded opponent on the ground and give the crowd a chance to decide if the wounded gladiator should be allowed to live or if he should be finished off and killed. The crowd would express approval by giving the thumbs up, and they would express disapproval and to finish off the wounded gladiator with the thumbs down. Unsurprisingly, gladiators, even the really successful ones, typically died young. If you were a gladiator and you lived to the age of 30, you were considered very lucky. Some of the famous gladiators were Spartacus, we talked about in a previous video. Flamma, he was a Syrian who was a gladiator, and he only lived to be 30 years old, but he won 21 gladiator fights. And even the Emperor Commodus, son of Marcus Aurelius, tried being a gladiator. An emperor fighting as a gladiator was a massive taboo, though, because remember, gladiators were technically slaves. And Commodus was generally seen as a more negative emperor for bucking Roman traditions. Here are some modern actors portraying gladiators. The one on the left is presumably a murmillo, which used a large, basically a scutum shield, a lot like what a Roman legionary would use. And the one on the right is the trax, who uses a much smaller shield. We can see there's judges along the side of the field. One has a stick to strike someone who's trying to escape the fight. This is the Circus Maximus. It was a chariot racing park in Rome. The tower in the foreground here is from medieval times. Most of the Circus Maximus is not existent anymore. Most of it has fallen apart. Small portions of it remain, and the track itself remains. But this is a image of a Roman charioteer. When Romans raced chariots, they used 4 horses. Typically on like a daily basis, if they were riding a chariot, they would only use 2. 4-horse chariots were a lot faster, but much more difficult to control. This is a 2-horse chariot with its 2 horses buried in what is now Croatia. And this is a chariot from Pompeii that is preserved by ash. Of course, chariot races have been, like gladiatorial contests, major themes in later Western culture. They've been featured in books and films, as you can see on this slide, which features a scene from the film Ben-Hur. This is a reconstruction of the Circus Maximus where the chariots would have raced. Other types of events would have been put on the Circus Maximus as well, but it was known especially for its chariot races. So now we'll discuss the amphitheater at Pompeii. Pompeii was a large enough town to have its own amphitheater. Its amphitheater was built probably around the year 70 BCE with certain renovations throughout its period, its development. And it was one of the largest amphitheaters in the Roman Empire until the construction of the Colosseum. And it would have hosted gladiatorial bouts for the residents of Pompeii and the nearby town of Herculaneum. It was the local ballpark, basically, for the Romans in the region. The patricians would have sat in the front rows so they could have the best view of the fights. And then the plebeians would have sat in the higher rows, the nosebleed seats, where they could see the fights, but also see the patricians in the front row. And of course, people would come and go through these arches, which are called vomitoria. Contrary to popular opinion, this is not the place that Romans would go and vomit. It's more that people would vomit in and vomit out of the vomitoria as they left the amphitheater or came into the amphitheater. And on the exterior of the amphitheater, there's graffiti and remains of posters and paintings of the gladiators made by the fans. This amphitheater has since been used for modern-day concerts. Even artists like Frank Sinatra and Pink Floyd have actually performed at this amphitheater down in the arena section. Here is the exterior of the amphitheater at Pompeii. You can see it's a mixture of brick and stone. It would have been covered in plaster, and it would have been covered in graffiti and paintings and posters at the time of the destruction of Pompeii. And here are some people touring the amphitheater, which gives you an idea of the size of the site. So it's smaller than a modern-day stadium, but it's pretty sizable. You could have quite a few gladiators fighting on this arena. So the Roman elite, they like to pay for sporting events, they like to pay for entertainment, bread and circuses for poor Romans, but they did not like to pay for public education. Public education was not really a thing in the Roman Empire. Wealthy people would hire slaves and free people, especially Greeks, to train their sons, usually their sons. Women and girls were rarely given education in a formal sense. Sons learned reading, writing, mathematics, history, philosophy, and public speaking. All of these were important skills that wealthy men would have needed to know to be successful patrons. They needed to know how to think, how to reason, how to speak, if they were to have a successful career as a patron and have a successful career in business or politics or the military. Daughters generally were not educated, but they might learn and listen in on the lessons. So they might pick up how to learn to read, for example. Roman students would write on wax tablets with basically pointy sticks called styluses. These were like chalkboards. When a student was done with their lessons for the day, they would take a candle and they would melt the wax off so they could use it the next day. In spite of the Romans' hesitancy to democratize education, though, the Romans did make some important inventions in the field of learning, especially codexes, basically what we call books today. Before this, writing was done on scrolls or on tablets, which is much more difficult to keep track of. And the image on the right-hand side is of Sappho, a Greek poet who was literate, and it's in Pompeii. So the owner of this fresco either was a fan of Sappho's poetry, or perhaps they felt that it was a good thing for women to know how to write and read. Here are some images of education in ancient Rome. Here are some examples of styluses. This is the remains of a tablet that would have had wax in the center for the purpose of writing. This is an early book, a codex. Obviously, the technology of books will improve over time. And then, of course, the Romans did not have access to printing. These were manuscripts written by hand. And here is a relief of a teacher tutoring students. One student is holding a scroll. The other student is holding either a tablet or a codex. It's hard to tell from the relief. Poorer Romans generally didn't have codexes and scrolls and things to write on, so they would leave behind graffiti. Graffiti was very common in Roman cities, and because Pompeii was destroyed so suddenly, there was no time for the Romans to paint over graffiti. It was basically frozen in time. Graffiti, like trash pits and middens as they're called in archaeology, while it would have been a nuisance perhaps for people in the past, it's very useful for archaeologists today. We can learn what regular people were thinking based on what they were writing. These are often the only written sources we have from everyday people. So what did Romans write about in their graffiti? Well, they wrote about the same things that people write about in graffiti today. They wrote down jokes, they made innuendos, they mocked famous people and religions, anything and everything. They even did things like leave reviews, perhaps in graffiti. Some restaurants around Pompeii, they would have inscriptions left by an unhappy customer who said, "Don't eat at this restaurant, the food is poison." Basically the Roman equivalent of a negative Yelp review. And there's evidence that both men, women, and children left graffiti behind. Women would talk about going on bad dates with men. Children would talk about their favorite toys, and men would make graffiti as well. And a lot of this graffiti was very, very crass, and a lot of things I can't say on YouTube. But this graffiti shows that a decent amount of the Roman poor were literate, and they knew that the people around them were literate. You're much less interested in leaving graffiti if no one else can read it. This is graffiti or a graffiti drawing of a gladiator. You can recognize the shield and the helmet and armor. Remember, gladiators were very popular to the Romans. They were the professional athletes in the Roman Empire. This is a collection of graffiti of hunters, venators, hunting what looks like a deer and a goat of some kind, and perhaps a wild boar. One of the venators appears to be riding a horse as well. So documentary sources, official documentary sources left by people like Pliny the Younger, a Roman scholar, suggested that Pompeii was destroyed in the late summer or early fall of 79 CE. But this charcoal graffito being singular for graffiti, mentions the date November 15th and 16th. It's written in charcoal. It's possible this was written by someone right before the eruption. They were writing the date. Or it's possible it's written by someone who was trapped by the eruption, and they were saying November 15th and 16th. So graffiti might actually reveal that the eruption of Mount Vesuvius happened a little bit later than previous scholars thought. So now we should discuss the people of Pompeii and how they were affected by the Mount Vesuvius eruption. It's estimated that about 2,000 people died in the Pompeii eruption, about 16,000 in the surrounding area. The ash would have made breathing very difficult and painful, and vision would have been almost impossible. Eyewitnesses said that the ash in the air made it darker than the darkest night. It was like being in a dark room with the window closed and no lamp. The majority of the population did escape, fleeing to the coast, but other people, particularly very young and very old people, and people who were vulnerable in Roman society, like slaves, were less likely to have escaped. And they would have either suffocated in their homes as the ash choked them to death, or they waited until the ash stopped, and then they tried to escape but were covered by the eruption's pyroclastic flow. basically lava that launched out of the volcano and through the city and drowned and burned the people that were trying to escape on foot after the ash had come. The lava would have left behind impressions of the people with their remains trapped inside. In the 1800s, early proto-archaeologists from the period, they took these impressions that had bones in them, they filled them with concrete to create the poses of the dead in their final moments. These are not mummies. This is concrete that's covering human bones. Modern archaeologists would not do this sort of thing. This would not be considered good preservation. It would be considered disrespectful to the deceased, and of course it would also make studying of the remains of the dead more difficult because they're now covered in concrete. But these proto-archaeologists, they were not interested in so much learning about the past as they were in just finding things from the past and collecting them. And that's exactly what they were doing when they filled these impressions in bones with concrete. We'll look at a few examples on the next couple of slides. So you can get a very good view of the poses of some of the humans that lived in Pompeii as they struggled to escape the eruption and the pyroclastic flow. You see them struggling against the ashes and struggling against the lava. And you can see the agony they would have dealt with as they died from this pyroclastic lava flow. We also see animals were covered by the flow as well. This is a pig and a dog. The dog appears to be trying to escape from a chain of some kind. We know the Romans often chained up their dogs. This is also a horse that was killed by the pyroclastic flow, or possibly was already dead and it suffocated from the ash. This is a slide showing a family that was killed in Pompeii, presumably by the pyroclastic flow. Studies done on the smallest individual by archaeologists and forensic anthropologists suggest the child was probably about 4 years old when they died. Here on the bottom you can see what these concrete casts begin to look like as the concrete breaks away. You can see the exposed skull of the person from Pompeii when they died. You can see, though, that this person had pretty good teeth by ancient world standards. He's not missing a lot of teeth. This is probably due to the fact that the Romans did not have a lot of sugar in their diet. This is the blast radius of Mount Vesuvius. People who were able to escape to the coast survived, but many others did not. Typically, it was, we think, older people and very young children who did not escape the blast and then the lava flow that came afterwards. So now that we've discussed life in the Roman heartland, the senatorial provinces, by looking at Pompeii, we'll close out this video by discussing life in the Roman provinces, the imperial provinces, on the edge or the frontier of Roman civilization. Provincials enjoyed some benefits from being in the Roman Empire: security from the Roman legions. The Roman legions would have prevented invasions by other peoples. They also would have suppressed bandits and things like that. They also took advantage of the infrastructure built by the Romans, roads, aqueducts, etc. Also, they would have been able to trade with other parts of the Roman Empire. The Romans allowed provincials to practice some elements of their culture. In some Romans, even soldiers actually adopted elements of provincial cultures as they lived with provincial people. You might say that these Roman legionaries were going native in more contemporary vernacular. So there was some tolerance and there was some cultural syncretism that the Roman government showed to provincial non-Roman people on the frontier. On the negative side, though, these provincials, they'd been brought into the Roman Empire usually by force, by conquest, and they had to pay taxes to Rome without receiving any kind of political representation, not until after 212, when all males in the provinces were made citizens. They also had to use either Latin or Greek as their kind of lingua franca, their language of business. Latin was used in the western parts of the Roman Empire, but Greek was actually used very commonly as the business language, even by Romans in the eastern parts of the empire. And of course, not all cultures and religions are really compatible with Roman culture. For example, the Jewish culture, which forbade the worshiping of the Roman emperor and the Roman gods because the Jews believed in one God. This led, of course, to the Jewish revolts of 66 through 70 CE, in which the Jewish temple was destroyed and the Jewish people were spread across the Roman Empire by force. This slide shows some examples, archaeological examples of cultural syncretism. On the left side is a Fayum mummy portrait from Egypt. It's a wooden portrait that was placed over a wrapped mummified body of the person who was mummified. It's done in a Greco-Roman style, but mummification was an Egyptian tradition. On the right-hand side is a statue of Mithras. Mithras was a Persian god that was very popular with Roman soldiers, especially those who were stationed in the eastern parts of the Roman Empire. There are also examples of cultural syncretism in Roman architecture on the frontier. This is the Lullingstone Roman villa built in Kent, England, occupied from about 100s to about the 300s CE. There's Roman-style ceramic tiles on the roof, but then other parts of the building, the walls especially, are made of local stone masonry and plaster, a lot like wattle and daub, which was used by Celtic people. The Romans generally preferred to build their buildings out of brick and concrete and marble. The floor plan of this villa is slightly different as well. Its atrium is closed off, and the building is much more rectangular in shape. The closed off atrium is probably because of the colder climate in Britannia. It's also interesting because the building does have a front porch, so perhaps during the summer, the inhabitants of the villa would sit on the porch since their atrium was closed off. And this is a recreation of what the Lullingstone villa would have looked like when it was being occupied, and here's what's left of the foundation. This is a scale model of the Lullingstone villa. You can see the porch here in the front. The atrium is more towards the center of the building. There are basins and places for washing, like the Romans built in their villas. There's a mosaic as well. We'll talk about this site again in the next video in the contents of the mosaic, but what you see is cultural syncretism. There's certain elements of Roman culture and architecture, but there's a lot of local, indigenous, sort of Celtic styles in how this building is built as well. So now we'll go to the southeast, we'll go to Egypt, and we'll look at some Romano-Egyptian mummy portraits. By the time of the Romans, the people in Egypt who were still practicing mummification were not putting their deceased in expensive anthropoid cases, like was done during Egyptian, sort of the Egyptian New Kingdom, for example. Instead, the mummies were wrapped in linen, and then a wooden portrait would be affixed to the head to represent what the deceased looked like in life. And these portraits are made in a Roman style. The Romans were very interested in portraiture. But the mummification, of course, is an Egyptian tradition. The Romans generally practiced cremation. So you're seeing Roman portraits, Egyptian burial customs being mixed together on the frontier down in Egypt. Some of these portraits can be very difficult to date because they've been separated from their mummies, which have inscriptions saying who the deceased was and when they died. But archaeologists have been able to roughly absolute date these portraits. What they've done is they look at the style of the portraits or the subjects' hairstyles, facial hair. What they see is that male portraits with facial hair probably came from the 200s when beards were more popular. Older portraits are usually feature subjects clean-shaven, as was common earlier in the Roman Empire. It's actually a little bit easier to date the portraits of women because women's styles changed more quickly, and they've been able to actually date some of these portraits or some of these paintings vary within like 10 years of when they think they were made. Once again, these are estimates. For example, based on the hairstyles of the subject, the woman in this portrait, we think that she probably died sometime in the 100s or 120s CE. And then based on the hairstyle and clothing style in this portrait, we think this woman died more in the 300s CE. So conclusion. There's important trends in the Roman Empire from 27 BC to 235 CE. We see the culture of virtue and obligation that was at the heart of the Roman civilization will continue. Roman emperors are expected to uphold this culture of virtue and obligation. Good emperors will do this successfully. Bad emperors will fail to have virtue and will fail their obligations to the Roman people. Emperors, politicians, and elite patricians modeled the patron-client service system through public service, through politics, through giving ludi festivals to the people, and through military service. Military expansion will continue through 117 CE. After this, the Roman Empire will become much more defensive, which will lead to problems for the Roman Empire, as we talked about. Poorer people and slaves, however, lived very difficult lives, even during periods of peace. But they also received benefits from the elite patrons, military security, infrastructure, food, and entertainment, which were paid for by wealthier people. These systems of obligation kept the empire together, although some people in the empire rebelled, the Jews, the Celts, the Germanic people, with varying levels of success. The Germanic people were successful, whereas the Celts and the Jews were not. These systems of obligation were very expensive, and they became more complex with time, especially on the frontier where Roman and non-Roman people coexisted. Not always peacefully, of course. And these systems of obligation are going to start to really break down after the year 235 CE, just because they're so expensive and because the Roman Empire is no longer focusing on conquest. Conquest brings money into the empire to sustain the systems of patronage and obligation. And once the conquest stops, the money stops. And once the money stops, the Roman Empire, or the Western Roman Empire, begins to collapse. We'll talk about the decline and fall of the Western Roman Empire in the next video.